Now, with Britain out of the EU, the UK government has moved to transform immigration policy, announcing plans this week which will end freedom of movement for EU citizens, replacing it with a points-based system. Potential immigrants to the country will now have to fulfil a variety of criteria, including the ability to speak English and earn at least £25,600. Here's what the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, had to say about the new proposals.
This basically redefines our immigration policy. So the brightest and the best, people with skills need to come to the UK, and we will no longer have the routes for cheap, low-skilled labour that obviously has dominated immigration and our labour market for far too long in this country.
Well, there's been much talk about the potential damage the plans could do to the hospitality, farming and care industries. But is there an economic case to be made for the government's points-based system? Well, I'm joined now by Ryan Shorthouse of the Conservative think tank Bright Blue and Vicky Price, the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research. Well, Vicky, is there an economic case to be made for this?
It's difficult to think why it would be any better than what we've got now. I mean, there are some positives to it. The interesting thing is that the cap on skilled workers is gone, and also you don't have to prove that you can't find anyone else who can do the job in the UK before you ask for someone else to be allowed to come in and do that job. So that's good news. But what it does suggest is that we'll be flooded possibly with people with high skills from elsewhere in the world rather than the EU. And it's worth bearing in mind that people coming from the EU generally have had higher skills on average than the people who are UK born, and they've been very employable and employed, and they have contributed very significantly to the economy. Now they are not coming in the numbers they used to come. In fact, net migration is the lowest it's been for 16 years from the EU. So we're going to be losing that aspect. And of course, all these people will not bother to necessarily start coming back again if they have to comply with all sorts of extra regulations. They can go elsewhere. There are plenty of places in Europe they can go to, or in the US, which has been attracting quite a lot of people anyway.
But the hope in sort of macroeconomic terms, Vicky, would be that particularly with lower wages, that the effect of this might be to boost wages, which a lot of economists would say would be a good thing given the current state of the economy, boost inflation, which again a lot of economists would say is precisely what's needed at the moment, and through trying to replace some low-skilled workers with some technology, boost productivity, which has been pretty disastrous in the UK economy since the financial crash. Any hopes of that, or do you think that's all not likely to happen?
Well, I think it's quite likely that wages will start going up in particular places. There are skill shortages already, despite the fact the economy is not growing very fast. There are some sectors where wages are indeed increasing. But overall, what you've seen is that the consumer, who has only just managed to get back to real wage levels that they were at just before the financial crisis, has not been prepared to pay more for anything. So there are constant discounts. Inflation is still a lot under control. What it means is that nobody who is running a business is going to want to employ more and pay more. They will want to cut back, and they will be introducing quite a lot of technology. Yes, productivity will go up, but the chances that people will be employed in larger numbers in relatively unskilled sectors in order to, which also will increase their prices or the wages if they are all UK people, is really unlikely. I think what firms will do when those shortages become tougher and more difficult to compensate for by bringing in workers from the EU or elsewhere, is they'll just probably introduce IT, cut back on their numbers, or reduce their own output. So I don't see this as a positive contributor to growth under any circumstance.
Well, Ryan, what struck me about your response to this plan was that you put the focus much more on the idea that there would be an increase in immigration from skilled workers than a decrease in immigration from low-skilled workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the new system the government is proposing chimes somewhat with general public opinion, which is that people do not want to see a reduction. A majority of people across the UK do not want to see a reduction in the levels of skilled migration. And of course, the old regime, when Theresa May was Prime Minister and Home Secretary, you had a net migration target which lumped all migrants together. And the public do think differently about different types of migrants. And so the regime that the government is proposing in their new points-based system is more open and welcoming to skilled migrants relative to the old non-EU regime that we had, in the sense that the salary threshold, the general salary threshold that you need to be admitted into the UK, will be lower, as will the skills threshold. And the government's even thinking about allowing people with much educational promise, and maybe there are other factors that they may bolt onto this later on, but people who are have got a job lower than the salary threshold may be able to gain more points to get entry if they show promise, for example, with their educational qualifications. So what this new system is doing is essentially allowing younger people, perhaps with lower salaries, in industries like the creative sector, where salaries are infamously much lower, to come into the UK and then contribute enormously over time. So it's more opening and welcoming to skilled migration than it was under the old non-EU system. However, Vicky is right that it's more restrictive than what we had with the EU system, because, of course, we had free movement. So people
and while you may be right, Ryan, people listening to this who run a hotel or maybe have a fruit farm or run one of these companies that provides care for local authorities for elderly people, they're going to say, well, that's all very well, but actually the reality is we are not going to be able to get the labour we need.
And I sympathise with that, because the system is more restrictive on what you would deem low-skilled migration. And, of course, I realise that that's controversial, because a lot of people in those types of professions are highly skilled and highly needed. So what the government was previously proposing when Theresa May was Prime Minister was that when we left the EU, we might be able to have what was called a youth mobility visa route. So that allows basically people who are aged 18 to 30 to come to the UK for 2 years and do whatever. That would be a route for low-skilled migrants to come in. The government haven't proposed that in their new points-based immigration system, and I think they should. They should look at that, because there are some sectors which will be excluded from the new...
Okay. Vicky, will Ryan's should become a will? I mean, it is difficult to imagine that if you really do start getting fruit and vegetables unpicked in the fields, if hotels and restaurants can't get staff, if the care industry is threatened with not being able to fulfil its contracts to local authorities, it's difficult to believe the government won't change the system.
Well, they have said in whatever they've published that they're going to keep their eyes to the ground, if you like, and see what is happening in particular sectors. So there is some flexibility that is allowed, and I think that's good too. But
and that in principle need not exclude. I mean, although they have been very negative in their response to the Scottish government's arguments for devolved immigration policy because of particular factors in Scotland. They would say there are particular factors in other areas, but there's nothing to stop them devolving some abilities to change immigration rules for certain areas of England and for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Well, they've said so far that they're not going to do that. So let's see what happens. But of course, not just Scotland. I mean, London has been arguing that it's a special case as well, because the dependence on EU workers is very significant. But because the system looks quite, attractive, perhaps for the skilled worker, but it also looks a bit complicated for anyone looking at it from the outside. How do I sort of add it all up and so on? There are a lot of expectations that in the end, it might end up being much freer than people think, and that there will be lots and lots of exemptions. So more or less we'll get back to where we were. Well, it'll be interesting to see if that happens. But the people from the EU who were coming before seem a lot less willing to do so. So certainly there will be a shift in terms of the composition of the people who come, even if the numbers perhaps remain pretty similar. And yes, there will be shortages in some sectors, and the whole hospitality area, which has grown quite significantly, is going to suffer. But it's interesting about the carers, because at the end of the day is how much the government is prepared to be paying in this.
I was going to say that. I mean, one effect of this could be to force what Theresa May proposed in her disastrous election campaign a few years ago, and has never happened, but is a wholesale rethink of the way we provide care to the elderly and of how we're prepared to pay for it and whether we're prepared to pay for it through taxation.
Well, the reason why carers are not paid very much is because that's the amount of money the government is making available and to the councils and elsewhere. So if that were to change, then yes, fine, they can become the high-skilled, which they already are, many of them, the high-skilled category that we want to have.
Ryan, on this idea that the thing can be changed, I mean, the politics of this, presumably, Dominic Cummings has always argued you'd have to demonstrate you've got control of immigration, and then the poison of immigration as an issue will go away. That once you've demonstrated as a government that you have control of the issue. Now, presumably, if he's right, then actually now they've demonstrated that they've got control. It would be easier to change it later on, once it becomes technical fixes to deal with particular regions of Britain or particular sectors of the economy.
I think you're right. That's the theory, which is that people are more concerned about the control we have on the numbers and types of migration coming in. And there was a sense that under the EU, where we had free movement, we didn't have that democratic control. So even if you have a high number system, at least you have control over it. There's a feeling amongst some Brexiteers who are now in chief positions in number 10 that's what you need. And indeed, what I would say is that if we're going to sign all these free trade agreements that the government is keen on to compensate for the loss of access to EU markets, a lot of those countries that we want to sign FTAs with will want to see a liberalisation in our visa regime to give preferential access for their citizens. So if the government is wanting to do all these free trade agreements, it may be that we have a lot more migration from those sorts of countries.
Yes,
so overall, the level...
It's an interesting point.
increases.
Apparently, the Times of India has been reporting, this is a big opportunity for Indian citizens to come to the UK.
Exactly. So, ironically, a lot of the reason why we came out of the EU because concerns about the high levels of migration. But, once we go to a system where we try and sign loads of free trade agreements with countries like India, it may be that our overall level of migration actually doesn't really change.
OK, look, we're going to have to leave it there for the moment at least. Vicky Price, Ryan Shorthouse, thank you both very much indeed.